Not every painful season in your life was punishment. Some painful seasons were preparation wearing the disguise of pain, and you were never given the manual to tell the difference while you were still inside it. And yet you called it wasted time. You called it a wound with no purpose. You accepted the idea that it meant nothing, without realizing God rarely explains himself while he is still working. You buried the memory instead of asking what it built in you. Today, I want to show you something that most Christians are not ready to hear. We're going to talk about 7 signs that the season you suffered through the most was actually the season God used to prepare you for something greater than you could see at the time. Because this does not just affect how you remember your past. It affects whether you can trust God with your future. If you cannot see the purpose behind the pain, you will resist the next assignment he has for you. And you will call every future difficulty abandonment instead of formation. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." Most Christians apply this verse to comfort someone else after a tragedy, but very few apply it honestly to their own unexplained suffering while they are still inside it, in the middle of the confusion before the outcome has arrived. And that blind spot has caused more spiritual confusion, more silent resentment toward God, and more stalled obedience than most believers are willing to admit out loud. The truth is this: God does not waste seasons. He does not waste heartbreak, delay, rejection, or silence. Every one of those things can be quietly repurposed into the exact preparation your calling requires, even when nothing about the process felt purposeful at the time. But if you refuse to look back with spiritual eyes, you will carry bitterness into a future that was supposed to be built on healed ground. You will keep asking God to explain a season he has already redeemed, instead of asking what that season built inside you. Today, we are going to talk about 7 signs that the painful season behind you was never punishment. It was preparation, and recognizing that difference will change how you walk into everything that comes next. The first sign is this: the season stripped away something you thought you could not live without, and you survived anyway. That stripping was not cruelty. It was God clearing space for something your hands were too full to receive, because a hand still holding on cannot also be a hand reaching forward. Consider a believer who lost a job she had held for over a decade. At first, it felt like the floor had opened beneath her. She could not see past the fear of the next paycheck, the identity she had built around that title, the routine that had structured her entire week. She spent nights lying awake, replaying what she could have done differently, convinced the loss was proof that God had overlooked her. But months later, after a season of applications and closed doors and quiet desperation, she found herself in a role that used gifts she had never even been allowed to develop at her old job. The very things that position had suppressed for years were suddenly required daily in the new one. The loss had not been random, it had been removal, and removal is not the same thing as rejection. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." The plan was already there before the pain arrived, sealed long before she understood what the loss was actually clearing room for. This is not abandonment, this is relocation. God does not always warn you before he moves you, and he rarely explains the move until you have already arrived somewhere new. Look at the last thing you lost and ask what space it created, not just what pain it caused. The space is often more important than the loss itself. The second sign is this: the season forced you to develop patience you did not have before, and that patience is now required for the assignment ahead of you. Patience is rarely given all at once. It is built slowly, in seasons you would never choose voluntarily. Imagine a Christian man who waited 3 years for a specific breakthrough that never seemed to come on schedule. Every month felt like another disappointment stacked on the last one. He grew frustrated with God's timing again and again, questioning whether he had misunderstood the promise entirely or whether God had simply changed his mind. He watched others receive in months what he had been asking for in years, and the comparison nearly hollowed him out. But by the time the breakthrough finally arrived, he had learned to lead a household, a team, and a ministry with a steadiness he never had before the waiting began. The waiting had built the very thing the blessing required, and had the breakthrough come early, he would have collapsed under the weight of carrying it. James chapter 1 verse 2-4 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete." The trial was never separate from the maturity. It was the mechanism that produced it. This is not delay for no reason. This is formation with a purpose, even when the purpose is invisible from where you are standing. Ask yourself what capacity you now carry that you did not carry before the waiting began. That capacity did not exist before the delay, and it will not disappear now that the delay is over. The third sign is this: a relationship ended that you were sure would destroy you, and its ending protected an assignment you did not know was coming. Some doors closed specifically because something behind them was never designed to travel with you into what comes next. Consider a young woman who was devastated when a long relationship ended without explanation. She replayed every conversation, searching for what she could have done differently, convinced that losing him meant losing her chance at the future she had planned around him. She spent months asking God why he would allow that kind of silence and confusion after so many years invested. Later, with distance and clarity she did not have in the moment, she recognized that the relationship had quietly been shrinking her confidence and her calling for years, teaching her to make herself smaller so he would feel comfortable. The ending was not rejection, it was rescue, arriving in a form so painful she almost missed what it was actually doing. Genesis chapter 50 verse 20 says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What looked like harm was already being repurposed before she could see any evidence of it. That is not loneliness. That is protection wearing a painful mask, and the mask is often the only reason we survive the process instead of fighting to stay. Examine what has grown in you since that relationship ended that could not have grown while it remained. Growth and that particular relationship could not coexist in the same season. If this message is already speaking to you, brother, sister, please subscribe to the Bible Warnings and write in the comments, "Lord, redeem every season I did not understand." Now let us continue, because the next signs are the ones the church almost never warns about. The fourth sign is this: your body or your health forced you to slow down at a time you refused to slow down on your own. Sometimes the only language strong enough to interrupt us is the language of the body. Picture this scenario: a believer pushing through exhaustion, ignoring every warning sign his body had been sending for over a year, convinced that rest was a weakness he could not afford. He measured his worth by his output and treated every hour of stillness as wasted time. When illness finally forced him to stop, he resisted the stillness for weeks, frustrated that his plans had been interrupted at what he considered the worst possible moment. But in that forced stillness, away from the noise and the constant motion, he heard direction he had been too busy to hear for over a year. The forced rest was not punishment. It was interruption with a purpose, arriving exactly when his soul needed it most, even though his schedule did not. Psalm number 46 verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness was never optional in that season. It was the assignment itself, disguised as an inconvenience. This is not a setback. This is a summons, and summons rarely arrive at a convenient time. Identify what you finally heard from God only after you were forced to stop moving. That message was waiting long before the stillness arrived. The fifth sign is this: you were misunderstood by people whose approval you once needed, and that misunderstanding severed a dependency God was already working to break. Approval can be one of the quietest chains a believer carries. Consider a Christian who was quietly excluded by a group of friends after taking a stand on something she believed in. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. She replayed the moment for weeks, wondering if she should have stayed quiet to keep the peace and keep her place among them. The rejection stung for a long season, longer than she expected it to, but over time, she noticed she no longer shaped her decisions around whether that group would approve, because their opinion no longer carried the same weight it once had. The misunderstanding had cost her their comfort, but it had given her something far more valuable: an unshakable dependence on God's opinion instead of theirs, a freedom she had not even realized she was missing. Galatians chapter 1 verse 10 says, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." The rejection revealed exactly whose approval she had been chasing all along. This is not exclusion. This is deliverance from an approval that was never meant to govern you, even though it felt, at the time, like the loss of something essential. Name one decision you now make freely, because that approval no longer controls you. That freedom is the fruit of the season you called painful. The sixth sign is this: a door closed suddenly without warning and without a clear reason, and you have since discovered it was never meant to open in the first place. Some closed doors are not obstacles, they are interventions. Imagine a believer who applied for a position he was certain was his calling, the exact role he had prayed toward for years. The rejection letter arrived within days, faster than he expected, and he could not understand why God would let the door slam shut so fast after so much preparation. He questioned whether he had heard God correctly at all, whether the years of preparation had been for nothing. A year later, that same organization went through a collapse that would have devastated anyone still inside it, taking positions, reputations, and years of work down with it. The closed door had not been cruelty. It had been foresight he could not see at the time, protection disguised as disappointment. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 9 says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." His plan was never the final word over his own steps, no matter how certain he had felt about it. This is not rejection. This is redirection in disguise, and redirection often looks identical to failure until enough time has passed to reveal the difference. Look at one closed door and ask what disaster it may have quietly spared you from. You may never get a full answer, but the question itself will loosen the bitterness. The seventh sign is this: you wept in a season with no explanation, and that grief cracked open a depth in your faith that comfort alone never could have produced. Some capacities are only built through loss, never through ease. Picture this scenario: a mother grieving a loss she never spoke about publicly, wondering privately if her faith could survive what she was carrying, if the God she had trusted her whole life could still be trusted after this. She did not feel strong during that season. She felt hollow, and every well-meaning word from others felt like it missed the depth of what she was actually facing. But years later, she recognized that the compassion she now carries for other grieving believers did not exist in her before that valley. She could sit with people in their worst moments without flinching, without needing to fix it, because she had once been sat with in hers. The grief had not just wounded her, it had widened her capacity to comfort others in a way nothing else could have. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 4 says God comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. The comfort she received was never meant to stop with her. It was always meant to move through her towards someone else. This is not a wound without purpose. This is a widening no comfortable season could have produced, no matter how much she might have preferred comfort at the time. Consider who in your life now needs the exact comfort your painful season taught you to give. That person may already be waiting for you. What we have walked through today carries real weight. Looking back at pain and calling it preparation is not easy, and it is not meant to erase what you actually suffered or minimize how real that suffering was while you were living through it. But God is not cruel, and He does not waste what you have already carried. Even the seasons that nearly broke you were seen, measured, and used by a Father who does not abandon His children in the dark, even when His silence felt like abandonment at the time. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10 says, "And the God of all grace, who called you to His eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast." The suffering was never the final word. Restoration was always coming behind it. When you begin to see your past through this lens, your future stops looking like a threat and starts looking like an inheritance you have already been trained to carry, because every season before this one was quietly preparing you for it. You are not the same person that painful season found you as. You carry patience you did not have, discernment you did not have, compassion you did not have, and freedom you did not have. And that is not an accident. That is preparation quietly finishing its work in you, one closed door and one sleepless night at a time. If this message spoke to your heart today, I want you to do one thing right now. Write in the comments, "Lord, redeem every season I did not understand." That is not just a comment. It is a declaration, and God honors it. And if you know someone still bitter over a season they cannot make sense of, someone still asking God why He allowed what they went through, share this with them today. Do not forget to subscribe to the Bible Warnings so we can keep growing together in biblical wisdom every single week. God bless you deeply, my brother, my sister. Until next time.